Not long ago, Josep Borrell, the High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs, ignited a firestorm of controversy when he invoked a provocative metaphor likening Europe to a garden, a beacon of civilization, order, and political enlightenment. The remainder of the globe, in his assessment, was dismissed as a vast, chaotic, and perilous jungle. It was a statement dripping with geopolitical condescension, projecting the old continent as a pristine paradise, while relegating the rest of humanity to the status of a backward periphery. However, merely a few years post-declaration, that very garden is emanating the distinct stench of institutional decay. It appears as though something malignant has been festering beneath the manicured lawns for too long and is now beginning to decompose right at the epicenter of the bloc. On one hand, the leadership within that garden, spearheaded by Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, is orchestrating a maneuver that many critics classify as state-sanctioned expropriation, engineering a legal framework to seize $300 billion in frozen Russian sovereign assets to funnel liquidity into Ukraine. $300 billion. To contextualize the sheer magnitude of this figure, it is sufficient to acquire the market capitalization of Netflix, Spotify, and Twitter combined, with ample capital remaining for Starbucks. Viewed through a geopolitical lens, that sum is capable of sustaining the entire economy of a medium-sized nation for a decade. Yet, while this colossal financial redistribution is being marketed as an act of justice and a mechanism for peace, law enforcement agencies within that pristine garden are breaching the private residences of high-ranking officials, seizing suitcases of illicit cash and uncovering secret ledgers linked to shocking bribery scandals. It turns out that in the garden proudly showcased to the world, the crop being cultivated is not democracy, but corruption and kleptocracy, what is afflicting the European project. Why are those who lecture the world daily on the rule of law increasingly exhibiting the behavioral patterns of organized crime syndicates? And within this volatile context, how will Vladimir Putin respond if the Russian Federation's $300 billion sovereign wealth chest is liquidated in broad daylight? The West did not arrive at the decision to raid Russia's coffers on a whim. 3 years of grinding attritional warfare have eroded the resilience of the entire transatlantic alliance. The United States, Britain, Germany, and France all were initially eager to pour capital and lethal aid into Ukraine, operating under the illusion of a cost-free conflict. But as inflation surged, and the costs of energy, fuel, and food skyrocketed, the electorate grew hostile, and the industrial base screamed for relief. The so-called moral imperative to defend democracy rapidly morphed into an unsustainable fiscal burden. The treasuries of many NATO capitals were so depleted that the mere mention of additional aid packages was enough to induce panic among finance ministers. In this climate of fiscal exhaustion, Kiev continued to demand more resources. Artillery stocks were critical, main battle tanks were in short supply, and the budgetary requirements to keep the Ukrainian state apparatus functioning needed underwriting. Modern warfare is so exorbitantly expensive that even major G7 economies are beginning to break out in a cold sweat. And then, amidst this financial desperation, the West identified a dormant gold mine locked within its own jurisdiction, $300 billion in assets belonging to the Central Bank of Russia, the vast majority of which were immobilized in European financial institutions, particularly in Belgium and Switzerland. That realization played out like a scripted drama. The eyes of Western policymakers lit up with a singular epiphany. Russia's capital is right here. Why not weaponize it? Thus, they devised a strategy they deemed geopolitically ingenious. Utilizing Russian capital to finance the war against Russia, it was a literal case of forcing the adversary to pay for their own containment, executed in the political style the West has become accustomed to, striking the opponent without extracting a single additional dollar from domestic taxpayers. However, geopolitical reality is rarely that simple. For decades, the West has anchored its global dominance on the international legal system to instruct the global South on the rules-based order. That system is predicated on one immutable pillar: sovereign immunity. This doctrine dictates that the assets of a sovereign state are inviolable unless the two parties are in a formal state of declared war. To seize Russia's money legally, in principle, the European Union would need to formally declare war on the Russian Federation, yet, crossing that Rubicon would drag Europe onto the escalation ladder toward a direct nuclear confrontation. No government in Brussels or Washington dares to take that existential risk. Consequently, the technocrats in Brussels began engineering legal workarounds. They deliberately fabricated new terminologies that sounded morally defensible and fiscally prudent: windfall profits tax, repurposing idle assets for humanitarian reconstruction, or collateralizing loans with Russian interest revenue. It sounds sophisticated, but if one strips away the glossy diplomatic vernacular, the core intent is crude. What they are targeting is not just the $300 billion principle, because touching that corpus would be a flagrant violation of international law, but the accrued interest generated by those assets, estimated at billions of dollars annually. And what is the European Union's endgame for this revenue? The answer is unambiguous: to procure artillery shells, missile systems, and armored vehicles for the Ukrainian armed forces, ensuring Kyiv can sustain high-intensity combat operations against Russia. From Moscow's vantage point, this is nothing short of highway robbery cloaked in the garb of legality. Russia accuses the European Union of dismantling the very international legal norms that the West itself established. The Kremlin warns that if the West opens this Pandora's box, any nation labeled as unfriendly could see its sovereign reserves expropriated at any moment. Russia has even threatened reciprocal asymmetry, seizing all assets owned by European corporations, still operating within Russian territory. What Western governments omit from their public statements, but privately understand, is that this represents an extremely dangerous economic escalation, because once the principle of protecting sovereign assets is shattered, confidence in the global financial architecture will collapse like dominoes. Developing nations, the global south, will gradually repatriate their reserves from the Western system, pivoting to the yuan, the ruble, or alternative non-dollar payment mechanisms to insulate themselves. This is the nightmare scenario of de-dollarization that the US and the EU fear most. However, as the Ukraine war enters a stalemate phase, Western leaders are forced to make immediate, crisis management calculations. Artillery magazines are empty, air defense interceptors are scarce, and Ukrainian manpower is degrading across multiple fronts. They require immediate liquidity, and that $300 billion block, even if the principle remains technically untouched, remains an irresistibly attractive cash cow. But this strategic play is not without internal friction. While Ursula von der Leyen and the hawkish faction in Brussels are aggressively championing the plan to liquidate Russia's assets as a noble crusade for world peace, a bucket of cold reality has been thrown in their faces, and according to intelligence analysis, the first entity to urge caution was none other than the United States. Simultaneously, right within the heart of Europe, a warning siren has sounded from Belgium itself. While EU officials continue to sermonize about morality, justice, and the rules-based order, the Belgian government and the executive leadership of Euroclear, Europe's premier securities settlement hub, have publicly warned of the catastrophic consequences of asset seizure. Why were they compelled to issue such a strong dissent? Because, fundamentally, the plan to seize Russian assets is a financial time bomb aimed squarely at the heart of the old continent. Euroclear currently serves as the central node in the European financial asset settlement and custody system. If the EU unilaterally expropriates Russian funds, Moscow will litigate filing suits in every international court outside EU jurisdiction. Once courts in non-Western jurisdictions order the freezing of Euroclear's assets abroad, the clearinghouse will become insolvent, triggering a systemic liquidity crisis and a chain of bankruptcies. The Belgian central bank would be forced to inject massive bailouts to save Euroclear. If it lacked the capacity, the Belgian sovereign rating itself would face the risk of default. But the most compelling aspect of this narrative is not merely financial, it is the exposure of hypocrisy. Belgium is not only cautious about the economic fallout, but is also inadvertently shining a light on the duplicity of the Brussels establishment. It is an open secret that those most vocal in demanding sanctions and asset seizures in the name of justice are the very individuals under investigation for unprecedented corruption scandals. The archetype of this rot is Qatargate. The entirety of Europe was stunned when Belgian police raided the apartment of Eva Kaili, Vice President of the European Parliament, once heralded as a symbol of a new generation of progressive leadership, and discovered suitcases stuffed with illicit cash, a scene reminiscent of a crime noir film. The origin of these funds, Qatar and Morocco, allegedly exchanging cash for covert political influence. It was a direct kinetic strike against the moral authority that the EU flaunts to the world. But Qatargate is merely the tip of the iceberg. Brussels is sitting on another potential detonation known as Pfizergate, involving secret text messages between Ursula von der Leyen and the CEO of Pfizer regarding a vaccine procurement contract worth tens of billions of euros. When finally released under pressure, the contract documents were almost entirely redacted, and to this day, the deal has never been transparently explained. Why were the messages deleted? Why is public procurement being treated like wartime classified intelligence? Those questions hang heavy in the air, while the European citizenry can only shake their heads in dismay. Not stopping there, investigative journalism continues to uncover probes involving numerous EU diplomats, suspected of receiving kickbacks from underground lobbying groups. The reality is that the bureaucratic machinery in Brussels has devolved into a swamp of graft. They live lavishly, enjoying exorbitant tax-free salaries, traversing the continent in private jets, and residing in five-star hotels, all while enacting policies that force the working class to labour harder and tighten their belts under austerity measures. When a compromised official stands on a podium to lecture on morality, or to punish Russia for corruption and authoritarianism, it descends into the most absurd geopolitical comedy of the century. Returning to the issue of Russia's $300 billion frozen in the West, many ask, will Putin remain passive and allow the Russian state to be robbed without recourse? The answer is unequivocal: absolutely not. The Russian Federation has been wargaming this scenario for years and has established a financial trap as sharp as a guillotine, the Type C account system. To visualize this geo-economic maneuver, recall the moment hostilities commenced in 2022. Hundreds of Western corporations, from Germany and France to the US, simultaneously attempted to exit the Russian market, seeking to repatriate capital, profits, and dividends. But the Kremlin declared, "It won't be that easy." President Putin signed a decree freezing all those funds, locking them into a series of restricted escrow accounts designated as Type C. The capital remains technically there, but it is sequestered, controlled, and not a single dollar is permitted to cross Russia's borders without explicit government authorization. Financial experts estimate that the volume of capital trapped in these Type C accounts is equivalent to, or arguably exceeds, the $300 billion that the West is withholding from Russia. It is a near-perfect symmetry, a classic trap in financial warfare. If the EU dares to legislate the confiscation of Russian reserves, Moscow is poised to activate its own financial nuclear option, the nationalization of all Western assets within Russia. In fact, we have already witnessed the preliminary warning shots. The Russian subsidiaries of Danone and Carlsberg were seized and transferred to Kremlin-aligned management at rock-bottom valuations. That sends a lucid message. If the $300 billion scenario is executed, Western investors stand to lose everything. At that juncture, who will bear the cost? Not Ursula von der Leyen, not the unelected bureaucrats in Brussels who remain ensconced in leather chairs and private jets. The primary casualties will be Western multinational corporations and European pension funds, the entities holding tens of billions of dollars in factories, infrastructure, equities, and profits currently hostage on Russian soil. It is a political decision made by the elite, but the economic fallout lands squarely on the private sector and the pensioner. Capital can be lost and regained, but once trust in the financial system is fractured, it is arduous, if not impossible, to restore. For over a century, the global economy has trusted the euro and the US dollar, not merely due to economic mass, but because the West has always marketed itself as a sanctuary of the rule of law. where private property is sacrosanct and ownership rights are inviolable. The Gulf monarchies, China, Brazil, and India have poured trillions of dollars into the Western financial ecosystem because they operated on the belief that, despite political friction or diplomatic conflicts, the West would not pilfer their reserves. But now, as that carefully crafted mask slips, the question becomes painful. What is Beijing thinking? What is the calculation in Riyadh? What will New Delhi, Brasilia, and Pretoria conclude? They will exchange glances and whisper the obvious truth. Today they are expropriating Russia. Tomorrow, if we fall out of favor, they will expropriate us. The inevitable consequence will be a systemic global asset flight. Non-Western nations will liquidate holdings in Euroclear, dump European bonds, diversify reserves into gold and the renminbi, or pivot to alternative payment architectures established by the BRICS bloc. This is the geopolitical capital flight that scholars have warned of, and it is accelerating faster than anticipated. The euro will weaken, and the West's hegemonic position will be eroded from within. The maneuvers of Ursula von der Leyen and her compromised entourage, when the dust settles, are not about saving Ukraine, but about shooting themselves in the foot, a self-inflicted wound that could mark the terminus of Europe's era of prosperity. In your assessment, who will pay the ultimate price if this $300 billion gamble is fully exposed?